Take a moment to really look at a modern map of Eastern Europe and study it without the noise that usually surrounds this conflict. Strip away the slogans, the moral framing, and the constant commentary that has dominated Western coverage, and a very different story begins to appear. What you see is not a sudden crisis, but a slow unfolding tragedy that was visible long before the first dramatic headlines. The direction of events was clear to anyone willing to look past wishful thinking and see the situation as it actually was. Today, we are standing near what feels like the closing phase of the war in Ukraine, a strategic endgame that has been approaching quietly for months, if not years. This moment did not arrive by accident, and it did not come without warning. At the center of this turning point, at the place where the decisive pressure is now converging, sits Odessa. For nearly 2 years, political leaders and commentators in Washington and London have insisted that the conflict was either frozen in a stalemate or gradually shifting in Ukraine's favor. They spoke confidently about breakthrough counteroffensives, revolutionary weapons, and technological advantages that would supposedly change everything. Tanks, fighter jets, and advanced systems were discussed as if war operated like a video game where a single upgrade could overcome geography, population limits, and industrial capacity. While attention remained fixed on the brutal fighting in eastern Ukraine, the most serious threat to the country's survival was quietly forming in the south. What we are witnessing now is a strategic nightmare that military planners have feared for generations, one that threatens not just the current government in Kyiv, but the existence of Ukraine as a viable state. The path unfolding points toward a reduced, landlocked country cut off from the sea and dependent almost entirely on Western financial support to function. This reality, ignored for far too long, is now sinking in within political and military circles in Washington and Brussels, where anxiety is rising behind closed doors. They understand something that is rarely said publicly. Without Odessa, the war is effectively decided. If Russia secures full control of the Black Sea coastline, the Western strategy does not merely fail, it backfires, producing results opposite to what was intended. To understand how this situation came about and why it may have been unavoidable, we need to step back from daily battlefield updates and examine the broader historical and geopolitical forces shaping the conflict. This requires viewing events through a realist lens, which holds that major powers act in predictable ways driven by survival, security, and influence, rather than moral narratives. Despite the language repeated in speeches and press briefings, this war has never been a simple contest between good and evil or democracy and tyranny. It is about power, regional security, and strategic realities that have governed state behavior for centuries. Russia's long-term focus has consistently centered on access to warm water ports. From the era of Peter the Great through Catherine the Great, expansion toward the Black Sea was driven not by abstract imperial ambition, but by economic necessity and military stability. Odessa is not just another city, it is the primary gateway through which the region's agricultural and industrial output reaches global markets. It functions as the economic lifeline of southern Ukraine, a port built under Russian rule and defended at immense cost during the Soviet period. The assumption that Moscow would ever accept this critical artery falling under NATO influence, potentially hosting American naval assets and nuclear-capable platforms, was always disconnected from reality. Yet this was the premise Western policymakers operated under, believing Russia would tolerate a rival military alliance positioning itself directly at its doorstep. NATO's expansion pressed steadily toward Russia's borders, and when Moscow reacted forcefully, Western leaders expressed shock. The contradiction becomes obvious when compared to American policy itself. The United States has long asserted through the Monroe Doctrine that no foreign power should project military force in the Western Hemisphere. When the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba in 1962, Washington did not resolve the issue through prolonged diplomacy. It imposed a naval blockade and signaled its willingness to risk nuclear war rather than accept a hostile alliance near its borders. That response was not exceptional. It was standard behavior for a major power. Yet when Russia applies similar logic to Ukraine, a region far more central to its historical security concerns, the action is labeled unprovoked aggression. This double standard exposes not just a moral inconsistency, but a deep strategic blind spot. For decades after the Cold War, Washington operated under the assumption that its global dominance was permanent, that it could reshape political realities anywhere without facing serious resistance. That illusion is now colliding with reality, and the looming fate of Odessa represents the moment when it fully collapses. It marks the confrontation between NATO's expansionist goals and Russia's refusal to accept what it views as an existential threat. The tragedy is that this outcome was not inevitable. A neutral Ukraine serving as a bridge between East and West was a realistic possibility, but U.S. policymakers rejected neutrality and pushed for full alignment. In pursuing that maximalist vision, they unintentionally guided Ukraine toward its current position. The refusal to seriously address Russia's strategic concerns, particularly in the Black Sea, shifted Moscow's calculations. While Russia may have initially focused on Crimea and eastern Ukraine, Western escalation changed the stakes, supplying longer-range weapons, targeting naval assets, and signaling permanent militarization made leaving Odessa under Kyiv's control an unacceptable risk from Moscow's perspective. War follows a harsh internal logic, and that logic now points toward Odessa as a necessary objective. Attempts to strengthen Ukraine through endless arms deliveries have instead pushed it closer to irreversible loss. The result is a country on the verge of losing its coastline, its economic independence, and its long-term viability. As Western influence proves unable to alter the underlying balance of power, as Russian forces continue their steady advance and Western stockpiles thin out, the situation unfolding around Ukraine's southern flank exposes the limits of American influence more clearly than almost any event in recent history. This moment is not simply about troop movements or territory gained and lost. It signals the fading ability of the United States to shape outcomes in regions where rival powers possess stronger interests, deeper resolve, and greater tolerance for long-term pressure. The approaching loss of Odessa is not just a military development. It reveals a much deeper shift, the erosion of Western leverage and the shrinking effectiveness of coercive power in the modern world. For years, Washington believed it could force compliance through financial pressure alone, freezing assets, cutting access to markets, and rallying allied sanctions to break opponents without firing additional shots. Early in the conflict, sanctions against Russia were promoted as an economic knockout blow. Officials confidently predicted a rapid collapse, a crashing currency, runaway inflation, and mass unrest that would destabilize the Kremlin from within. Think tanks and commentators spoke openly about leadership change, convinced that economic pain would quickly translate into political upheaval. But these projections were built on flawed assumptions. What actually happened ran counter to nearly every confident forecast. After an initial shock, the ruble stabilized. Russian markets adjusted and began to recover. Industrial production surged, particularly in sectors tied to defense and heavy manufacturing that Western analysts assumed would crumble without imported technology. Instead of contracting, the Russian economy began growing faster than many major Western economies, including Germany and the United Kingdom. Store shelves stayed full, inflation leveled off, and factories ramped up output. Russia now produces more artillery shells, drones, and ammunition than the entire NATO alliance combined, a reality that has shocked Western defense planners. This gap between expectation and reality highlights a fundamental failure in Western strategy. The United States assumed that economic tools effective against smaller, financially dependent states would work just as well against a resource-rich, industrially capable power. But Russia's economy is not built around financial engineering or service-based growth. It is grounded in physical assets, energy, minerals, metals, food production, and industrial inputs that form the backbone of modern civilization. These are not assets that can be frozen with a keystroke or replaced with policy announcements. Natural gas cannot be printed, wheat cannot be sanctioned into existence. Critical materials like palladium, fertilizers, and industrial gases cannot be conjured through press conferences. Russia holds a unique position as one of the world's largest suppliers of the tangible resources that keep economies running. The idea that such a country could be economically isolated into submission reflected a deep misunderstanding of how the global system actually functions. In trying to cut Russia off, Europe ended up severing its own lifeline. Restrictions on Russian energy triggered an energy shock that hit Germany particularly hard. Once Europe's industrial engine, German manufacturing, faced soaring costs, factory closures, and declining competitiveness, entire sectors struggled to survive. Russia, meanwhile, redirected its exports toward Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, regions unwilling to damage their own economies to serve Western geopolitical goals. In practical terms, the West ended up sanctioning itself. This miscalculation helped create a parallel global economy operating largely outside Western oversight. Russian oil flows through a vast network of tankers under obscure flags, moving crude to refineries in India. That fuel is then sold onward, including back to Europe, often at higher prices. Governments maintain the appearance of moral distance while quietly depending on the same energy supplies through indirect channels. It is geopolitical theater, a performance designed to preserve narratives rather than change material realities. But this shift extends far beyond oil. By turning the dollar into a political weapon and seizing sovereign assets, the United States sent a powerful signal to the rest of the world. Countries across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East began to conclude that their financial security could not rely on systems controlled by Washington. The result has been a rapid acceleration of de-dollarization. Trade increasingly settles in local currencies. The yuan now dominates Russian transactions. BRICS has evolved from a loose grouping into a growing geopolitical bloc, expanding membership and influence over trade and resources. By attempting to isolate Russia, Washington pushed it into deeper partnership with China, creating the very alignment American strategists once worked hard to prevent. Russian resources combined with Chinese industrial capacity now form a powerful foundation for long-term cooperation. At the same time, Western policymakers underestimated how adaptable global supply chains really are. Predictions that Russia would be crippled by losing access to Western technology proved wrong. Moscow had prepared for this scenario for years, building domestic alternatives and establishing channels for indirect imports. Goods flow through Central Asia, Turkey, and the Caucasus, bypassing restrictions with relative ease. Components cross borders quietly, moving through multiple intermediaries until they reach their destination. In a global economy driven by profit and interconnection, airtight blockades are nearly impossible. While this adaptability strengthened Russia, it exposed serious weaknesses in Western defense industries. Factories in the United States and Europe struggled to produce weapons at the scale modern warfare demands. Decades of outsourcing, deindustrialization, and reliance on just-in-time logistics have left the West poorly prepared for prolonged conflict. The belief that NATO could easily outproduce Russia has collapsed. Stockpiles are depleted, production lines are slow, and rebuilding capacity will take years, not months. This is why concern is spreading in Washington. Sanctions were supposed to be a low-cost way to weaken Russia. Instead, they generated economic strain at home and hardened the very opponent they targeted. Russia has emerged more self-reliant, more connected to non-Western partners, and more resilient than at any point since the Soviet era. Europe has paid the highest price, facing inflation, high energy costs, and industrial decline that are not accidental but direct consequences of policy choices tied to the Ukraine war. The tools that once defined American dominance have proven far less effective than expected, setting the stage for consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. The economic miscalculations surrounding Russia are serious, but they are only part of a much larger problem. Beneath them lies a moral contradiction at the core of Western policy that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The language coming from Washington and its allies presents the United States as a defender of freedom, sovereignty, and democratic values. Yet when these claims are measured against historical patterns, the narrative quickly unravels. Time and again, American intervention has not lifted vulnerable nations, but drawn them into destructive confrontations that serve broader strategic goals. Countries are encouraged to take hardline positions they cannot sustain, promise protection and support, and then left to deal with the consequences once their usefulness fades. This is not a theoretical critique. It is a recurring pattern visible across decades of foreign policy, and Ukraine is now following the same path. Iraq was sold to the world as a necessary intervention to remove a dangerous regime and protect global security. The justification rested on claims of weapons of mass destruction that were never found. What followed was not stability or democracy, but the collapse of state institutions, years of violence, and the emergence of extremist movements that destabilized an entire region. The country remains fractured, its sovereignty compromised, and its population deeply scarred. Libya followed a similar trajectory. Western leaders argued that military action was needed to protect civilians and uphold humanitarian principles. NATO's intervention dismantled the state, destroyed infrastructure, and left a power vacuum filled by militias. A country that once had some of the highest living standards in Africa descended into chaos, with open-air slave markets becoming one of the most disturbing symbols of the aftermath. Syria, too, became a battlefield for external ambitions. In the effort to weaken regional rivals and reshape the balance of power, weapons flowed into the country, often ending up in the hands of extremist groups. So-called moderate factions frequently held ideologies indistinguishable from those they were meant to oppose. The result was prolonged war, devastated cities, and millions displaced. These outcomes were not accidents. They were the predictable consequences of policies driven by strategic objectives, dressed in moral language to avoid scrutiny. Ukraine now fits this pattern with unsettling precision. Western governments encouraged Kyiv to abandon neutrality, dismiss agreements that could have limited escalation, and believe that NATO membership or indefinite military support would guarantee security. Instead, Ukraine has become a proxy battlefield. Its population base is shrinking as millions flee. Cities are damaged or destroyed. A generation of young men is being consumed by trench warfare reminiscent of conflicts many believe belong to the past. Western aid keeps the state functioning, but at the cost of its long-term sustainability. What is happening is not the rescue of Ukraine, but its gradual exhaustion in service of a geopolitical strategy that prioritizes weakening Russia over preserving Ukrainian society. This contradiction is rarely acknowledged by those shaping policy. By framing the conflict as an absolute moral struggle, Western leaders have trapped themselves in a position where compromise appears illegitimate. Negotiation becomes politically impossible without undermining their own messaging. As a result, Ukraine is pushed toward goals that were never realistically achievable. The consequences of this approach are becoming increasingly clear. The potential loss of Odessa represents the most devastating outcome, not only in military terms, but symbolically. It reflects how Ukraine's future has been gambled by decision makers far removed from the battlefield. Once Odessa is lost, Ukraine loses its most important port, its access to maritime trade, and the economic foundation necessary for long-term independence. It becomes a landlocked state reliant on continuous external support. When that moment arrives, Western officials are likely to redirect blame, pointing to corruption, tactical mistakes, or leadership failures in Kyiv. But the underlying reality will remain unchanged. Ukraine was drawn into a conflict it could not win, encouraged to take uncompromising positions that ensured disaster, and used as a buffer in a confrontation between major powers more focused on their own strategic rivalry than on Ukraine's survival. The global South has been watching this process carefully. Nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are familiar with the consequences of Western intervention. They remember coups back from abroad, economic pressure used to enforce alignment, and wars justified with lofty rhetoric that ended in ruin. These countries are not persuaded by speeches about freedom and democracy. They recognize the pattern and respond accordingly, choosing neutrality or alternative partnerships rather than aligning with Western demands. This is why Ukraine's looming loss of Odessa carries meaning far beyond Eastern Europe. It exposes the widening gap between how the West views itself and how it is perceived elsewhere. It demonstrates that moral narratives used to justify geopolitical action are losing credibility. For many countries, the conflict reinforces the belief that American leadership no longer offers stability or fairness, but opportunism framed as idealism. The irony is that many ordinary Americans genuinely believe in the values their leaders invoke. They want peace, cooperation, and mutual respect. Yet those ideals have been repeatedly used as branding tools by a political class whose actions undermine them. As the war approaches a decisive phase and Odessa stands at risk, the consequences of these choices are becoming impossible to ignore. Russia grows more confident. Ukraine is left damaged and dependent. And Western moral authority, already strained, weakens further. Ukraine's tragedy is not just a military failure. It is the result of a worldview that prioritizes dominance over diplomacy, narrative control over material reality, and short-term strategic advantage over the long-term well-being of nations caught in between. As Russian forces tighten their position along the Black Sea coast and move closer to Odessa, what we are witnessing extends far beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. This phase of the war is accelerating a global realignment that Washington never intended to create. In attempting to isolate Russia militarily and economically, the United States has instead helped bring into existence a counterbalancing coalition that now operates with increasing coordination. What has emerged is not a loose set of relationships, but a growing alignment of interests linking Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Each of these states contributes capabilities that offset the weaknesses of the others, forming a strategic ecosystem that challenges American influence across multiple regions at once. Russia provides vast natural resources, energy supplies, and extensive battlefield experience. China contributes industrial scale, technological capacity, and deep integration into global trade networks. Iran offers asymmetric warfare capabilities and regional influence across the Middle East. North Korea adds artillery production, missile development, and a willingness to act unpredictably. Together, they create a diversified bloc that can apply pressure simultaneously in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. This shift represents an escalation dynamic not seen since the Cold War. Washington believed it could degrade Russia without provoking broader strategic consequences. Instead, pressure applied in one theater has produced responses across many others. While the United States focused on delivering advanced weapons to eastern Ukraine, China quietly restricted exports of critical materials such as gallium and germanium, elements essential for semiconductors, radar systems, and advanced military electronics. This was not a coincidence. It was a calculated signal highlighting the West's dependence on supply chains controlled by the very country it seeks to contain. At the same time, Russia leveraged its role as a major exporter of energy and food, influencing inflation, supply stability, and living costs worldwide. These tools may not involve direct combat, but their impact is widespread and profound. Modern conflict is no longer confined to trenches and missile strikes. It extends into shipping lanes, manufacturing hubs, commodity markets, and financial systems. As the United States relies heavily on sanctions and financial pressure, its rivals increasingly target the physical foundations of the global economy. The strain this creates is becoming visible across multiple regions. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Middle East. As American attention and resources are absorbed by the Ukraine conflict, the regional order Washington spent decades shaping has begun to erode. Disruptions in the Red Sea, where a relatively small militia has interfered with one of the world's most critical maritime corridors, illustrate this shift. The fact that low-cost drones can force the United States and its allies to expend millions of dollars on defensive interceptors exposes an unsustainable imbalance. It highlights both the rising confidence of actors opposed to Western dominance and the declining efficiency of American military spending. At the same time, Russia's expanding cooperation with Iran and North Korea creates leverage points across the globe. Any escalation in Ukraine can be met with pressure in Syria, the Persian Gulf, or East Asia, forcing Washington to divide its focus and stretch its resources even further. The uncomfortable reality is that the U.S. military's logistical and industrial foundation is not prepared for such a multi-front challenge. The war has revealed deep vulnerabilities within the Western defense industrial base. Years of outsourcing, reduced stockpiles, and reliance on complex global supply chains have left both the United States and Europe unable to sustain prolonged high-intensity warfare. Weapons deliveries to Ukraine have drained inventories to the point where analysts openly acknowledge that the U.S. would face shortages of precision-guided munitions within days of a major conflict elsewhere. Artillery production remains far below Russian output, and efforts to expand manufacturing are slowed by shortages of skilled labor, raw materials, and outdated production infrastructure. These are not abstract concerns. They are shaping strategic decisions right now. As Washington commits resources to Eastern Europe, other priorities are left exposed. Domestic infrastructure deteriorates. Border security remains unresolved. Commitments in the Pacific become harder to fulfill. This imbalance reflects a deeper strategic confusion, an inability to clearly define what matters most for long-term national security. The same confusion appears in the economic sphere. Sanctions and counter-sanctions have fractured global trade in ways that will not easily reverse. The era of cheap energy, predictable supply chains, and stable prices rested on two pillars: affordable Russian energy for Europe and efficient Chinese manufacturing for the world. One pillar has already been damaged. The other is under growing strain. The result is a global economy marked by higher costs, greater volatility, and persistent uncertainty. Western citizens now feel the impact directly through rising energy bills, higher prices, disrupted supply chains, and declining industrial competitiveness. These are not temporary disruptions. They are structural changes driven by great power rivalry and the deliberate fragmentation of a once integrated global system. At the diplomatic level, the West's isolation is becoming increasingly clear. While official votes and statements may suggest broad support, the countries that will shape the future of global growth and trade are choosing not to align with Washington on Ukraine. China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, South Africa, and others are prioritizing their own interests. Many view the West as a declining force, more focused on issuing demands than building equitable partnerships. They see a rules-based order applied selectively, where some nations are bound by restrictions while others claim exemptions. As efforts intensify to prevent the loss of Odessa, responses from much of the world remain muted. Governments are preparing to work with whoever emerges strongest from the conflict, and the momentum is clearly shifting away from Western dominance. The reality that now confronts Washington is stark and unavoidable. The potential loss of Odessa will send a signal far beyond Ukraine's borders, one that reshapes how power, credibility, and security guarantees are perceived worldwide. It will demonstrate that American influence can be challenged and overcome when rivals possess sufficient resolve, resources, and coordinated support. This realization will not remain confined to Europe. It will ripple outward, reshaping alliances, encouraging nations to hedge their bets, and accelerating the shift toward a multipolar world where the United States no longer dictates outcomes but must compete within them. For the first time in generations, Washington is no longer setting the rules of the international system. It is reacting to forces it once believed it controlled. The geopolitical landscape is shifting in real time, and the world emerging from this conflict will look very different from the one American policymakers imagined at the start of the war. The fall of Odessa would not simply represent the loss of a city. It would mark a tipping point in a broader global transformation already underway, driven not by ideology or rhetoric, but by hard power, industrial capacity, strategic geography, and national self-interest. We are watching the closing phase of a long historical cycle, a moment when assumptions that guided Western power for decades collide with realities that can no longer be ignored. As Russia moves closer to securing the Black Sea coastline, the Western political establishment faces a crisis not just of strategy, but of identity. The United States now stands at a crossroads that will shape global order for generations. One path requires a sober acceptance that the unipolar moment was temporary, that the world has transitioned into a multipolar structure where restraint, prioritization, and negotiation are essential. This path would demand a shift away from ideological crusades and toward rebuilding domestic industry, restoring economic resilience, and focusing on core national interests. It would mean abandoning the belief that America can redesign political systems across the globe and instead adapting to a world of rising powers with competing priorities. The other path is the one Washington appears more inclined to follow, a refusal to acknowledge the changing balance of power and a determination to double down through more sanctions expanded military commitments, and intensified moral rhetoric. History shows that this is the typical behavior of declining empires, an attempt to reclaim lost dominance through overreach rather than adaptation. This approach leads to economic strain, overstretched forces, escalating confrontations, and the growing risk of miscalculation. The insistence on pursuing maximalist objectives in Ukraine has become a symbol of this deeper strategic confusion. In trying to preserve the image of American omnipotence, policymakers have weakened the substance of U.S. power, draining weapons stockpiles, exposing fragile supply chains, and eroding trust even among allies. The belief that narrative control and moral framing could override material limits has guided Ukraine toward outcomes that were always predictable. Odessa's likely fall will stand as the physical marker of those decisions. Geography still governs war. Ports cannot be defended by speeches. Supply lines do not function on slogans. Global influence cannot be sustained by narratives that collapse when confronted with economic and industrial reality. Ukraine was promised security, prosperity, and integration into Western institutions. What it has received instead is mass displacement, a shattered economy dependent on external funding, and the looming loss of maritime access essential for long-term survival. A country that could have served as a bridge between East and West has been transformed into a weakened buffer zone, its future shaped by forces far beyond its control. As borders are redrawn through force, the United States must confront whether the costs imposed on its allies, its economy, and its credibility were justified. Was it worth weakening the dollar's position by weaponizing finance? Was it worth driving Russia and China into a lasting strategic partnership? Was it worth the energy shock, inflation, and industrial decline felt across Europe and beyond? These questions are no longer theoretical. They are the direct consequences of choices made by decision makers who underestimated how quickly the global balance of power was changing. This trajectory was not inevitable, but it was accelerated by arrogance, ideological rigidity, and a failure to grasp material constraints. The fall of Odessa will become the epitaph of this era, marking the end of a worldview that assumed the United States could act without consequence, immune to the limits that bind every other nation. The global South is asserting itself. Regional powers are gaining confidence. New alliances, currencies, and institutions are forming outside Western control. The central question is whether Washington will adapt to this reality or continue exhausting its remaining influence in pursuit of an order that no longer exists. Understanding what comes next requires stepping outside dominant narratives and recognizing that power is determined not by moral language or media framing, but by resources, manufacturing, capacity, demographic stability, and geography. As Ukraine moves toward becoming a landlocked state, its fate shaped by decisions made far from its own borders, the consequences of strategic illusion become impossible to deny. The final chapter of this war has not yet been written, but its direction is clear. If you want to understand these shifts without propaganda, to examine power as it truly operates rather than how it is marketed, this is the space for that conversation. Like the video, if you found value in this analysis, subscribe for deeper breakdowns, and turn on notifications to stay ahead of what comes next. And now, your perspective matters. If Odessa falls and Ukraine loses access to the sea, do you believe the United States will continue funding the war or will support quietly fade as it has in past proxy conflicts? And as new currencies rise and de-dollarization accelerates, does the decline of American financial dominance threaten long-term security, or is it simply the natural correction of an overstretched system? Share your thoughts below.